All right. Well, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be joining us from. This is going to be our October 2021 Charlotte area SharePoint user group meetup. My name's Andy. I'm going to get things kicked off here tonight. See some friendly faces, some familiar faces, and some brand new faces. Want to welcome you all to our KSUG meetups. We typically meet on the third Thursday of every month. We've been doing virtual online events throughout the pandemic, but in non-pandemic times, we do hybrid events. We meet in person as well as virtual online using Microsoft Teams. Appreciate your participation and patience this evening as we are experimenting with implementing Teams webinars as our primary driver for events. There was a little bit of an extra step with the registration between registering with Meetup and then re-registering with Microsoft, trying to work out the kinks with that. But webinars just give us a little bit more control, so we can designate a presenter versus attendees, and then just have a little bit more control over the meeting, just to make sure everything moves along smoothly. So a little bit of housekeeping as we kind of get set and for this evening's meetup. You found us probably through Meetup, but we're also on other social media channels. You'll find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and we have an internal, external Yammer group that we use as well. But feel free to follow us on those channels, engage with us through there. We try to keep you up to date with what's coming up with the user group, but also things that are happening in the local community, networking, job opportunities, and so forth. In addition to those social media channels, if you need any of them, let us know. We'll be sure to get you the information. But the best way to find us is casug.org, casug.org. That's our primary. It's the best and easiest way to find us. And then all of our other social media is actually linked from there. We are also active in the YouTube world. We do try to record our meetings and post those on our YouTube channel. We have a bit.ly link for that, bit.ly/CASUGYT, so CASUGYT. Join our channel, subscribe, follow along with us. You can go back through the presentation that we had the previous month. We're getting some pretty good traction over there and some engagement. Also, feel free to use the Q&A, ask some questions. We'll send Daniel Christian over there and let him answer all the questions for you, because he's the YouTube pro of the group. So those are the different places and ways that you can engage with us. We are hoping at some point that we're going to be able to meet in person. As of right now, we're not looking at having any online or any in-person event here in 2021, but we're shooting for 2022. Hopefully, we'll be able to get back together in person, see everybody's smiling faces. Next up, let's talk about what's coming up for us. So in November, we're going to do a Microsoft Ignite recap. Microsoft Ignite is going to be the first week in November. It's live, online, it's free to attend. But we're going to do a recap of Microsoft Ignite and many of the announcements there related to SharePoint, OneDrive, Microsoft Teams, Power Apps, Power Automate, and some of the other applications that we work with here in the SharePoint world. So we're going to do a Microsoft Ignite recap on November 18th at 5 p.m. So feel free to follow up with us. If you need any information on how to participate in Microsoft Ignite, or if you just want to tune in for the recap, join the meetup. We'll be there and participating. So that's going to be on November 18th, and really looking forward to that. There's some cool things coming. That's all I'm going to tell you. There's some cool things coming, and we're going to hear some really cool announcements in the next couple of weeks when Ignite actually kicks off. I know I'm personally looking really forward to it. I will be there participating online in the Alt VR space in support of Microsoft Teams. So that's going to be a lot of fun. There's a couple of keynotes I'm looking forward to. Jeff Keeper's keynote. It's going to be really awesome. I'm looking forward to what they're going to be able to talk about there. But there's all kinds of different ways to participate. So if you need any assistance with that, reach out to us and we'll get you set up and in the right place. So with that, tonight we are very lucky to have Microsoft MVP, best-selling author, entrepreneur, the guru over at C5 Insight. He has participated in Charlotte SharePoint Saturdays for a number of years now. He's been heavily involved in the SharePoint community as well. We're welcoming Jeff Abels here this evening. We've got some contact information here where you can find Jeff, whether it's on Twitter, LinkedIn, or as he put it in his bio, good old email, snail mail. We've got some contact information there. So we're really excited to have Jeff tonight, where we're going to be talking about SharePoint and Teams overcoming security insecurity. Now, this is a bit of a departure from some previous talks that we've had with Jeff. If you haven't seen him speak before, you're in for a good time, because his talks are always really, really entertaining, as well as really educational. So I'm not going to steal the thunder for his bio, so I'm going to go ahead and welcome Jeff to our October meetup.
So thank you, Andy. But you've just set the bar way, way higher than I can possibly achieve today. But thanks. So yeah, today's topic, it's something Kelly Jones and I actually kind of worked on. I don't want to say worked on together. I don't want to throw Kelly under the bus of anything I put here that may or may not align. But Kelly kind of sat through some of this, and I said, hey, do you think that the user group would benefit from seeing this? And he said that might be a good topic. So that's why I'm here. I'll also say, of the people I know in the room today, I know less about SharePoint than anybody I know in the room. There's some people I don't know who might not know as much, but very intimidating for me, because security is a very old topic with SharePoint, and many of you probably know a great deal about it. Many of you probably know a great deal more than I do. So I will freely own my ignorance and say, if there's something, I don't think I'll say anything wrong, but if there's something I say in terms of, hey, there's another option, did you think about this? I welcome hearing that in today's session, because there are a lot of different ways to tackle security. What I try to do is be very business oriented and focus on the end user, sort of the site owner or the team owner, rather than the senior SharePoint solution architect or developer or overall SharePoint administrator or something like that. So I think there'll be a lot of value in there for folks in those different roles. So that said, let me kind of do the slide thing. Can everybody see my slides, by the way? Yeah, thumbs up or yes? Okay, cool. All right. So let's dive in. And I'm gonna do partly slides, but I'm gonna do partly some demoing some things. And you'll see, I've come up with a new way I actually do these demo-y things now that may not be too revolutionary, but I found it helpful for me and the audience a little bit. So we'll do a little bit of that. As always, I've probably developed more content than I possibly have time to present in the allotted time. So we'll get through as much of it as we can, and the slides will be available to anybody else who wants to dive deeper into it. Andy did an awesome job introducing me, so I'm not really going to introduce myself other than to say, you've already heard a lot of the stuff on the left about I run a business that does this. We're in the dynamic space, the Power Platform space, and the Microsoft 365 space. And I geek out on it and write books on it. I'm super proud to say one of my longtime coworkers, Trisha Desso-Cox, is just about to release her first book called Revenue Engineering, focused more on the dynamic side of the type of business we work on. And aside from all the geeky business stuff, there's the human side. My wife and I love fine spirits, whether it be wine or bourbon. We love riding a Harley Davidson together. We try not to enjoy the fine spirits and the Harley Davidson within the same setting. We're recent grandparents. Actually, that's an old picture of Theo. He is now almost exactly 18 months old, sporting the Powered by Luck shirt. And there's our house pup that keeps us company now that we're empty nesters. Her name is Verdi. All right, so here's what I'm going to try to go through today, starting kind of the very basic level, drilling into what might a user, a non-owner of a site, do around security, and then how do you administer site security? What about lists? What about other site types? Because I'm starting from Teams and working down, as you'll see in a minute, and then a little bit of reference material to kind of summarize everything. Time permitting, I'll also talk about some more general administrator settings that have to do with security and securing your whole SharePoint platform as well. So some of the basics. So for those of you who don't know, and one of the things I really like about SharePoint is everything in it is hierarchical. It can seem a lot of people I get to engage with on the client side feel a little overwhelmed because there's just so many things in SharePoint and Teams, and it almost feels like a loose collection of different things that you put together. But really, everything's arranged very hierarchically, and understanding those couple of hierarchies that Microsoft has organized everything around really goes a long way to helping you understand the whole structure of how it works. And so SharePoint and the underlying security architecture is really hierarchical. Now, I haven't seen this chart done exactly this way before. I did it this way to kind of say in the world of Teams, Teams kind of sort of is at the top of the hierarchy, right? You create a team, and in a team you have owners and members, and then under the team you have SharePoint, and it essentially rolls the roles out that you defined at the Teams level across all these other components. But if we look at that a little more closely, first of all, I would say in this hierarchy, Teams is an optional component, right? You can have SharePoint sites that are not associated with a team. The other thing that's optional is you may or may not be using folders in this hierarchy. Both of those are okay, but understand if you do have those in the hierarchy, the security settings, the way I'll talk about them, kind of rolled down, and I'll talk more about what that means. The other thing I've done on this diagram is you see I've crossed out sites and subsites and just had site collections. So don't want to get too deep into this, but whenever you create a team, you create a SharePoint quote site, but what you're really creating is a site collection, which includes kind of the core site for that site collection. And that seems to be sort of the MO for Microsoft now, right? So we're going to go more towards this modern experience, modern sites, what I call a Teams first approach, which doesn't mean that SharePoint doesn't have a place, but it does mean a lot more of the work we do is taking place in Teams that used to take place in SharePoint, and it uses SharePoint as a background component for that. So I cross that out saying, let's not really talk about that today, but understand that is in the hierarchy. If you're using more classic SharePoint with sites and subsites under your site collections, hierarchy works the same way. Those are sub-tiers of the hierarchy. So making those adjustments and looking at it this way, when you set permissions at the highest level you created. We're going to start Teams first today. So you're going to learn how you set permissions on a team and how those flow through to SharePoint. But we'll talk a little bit about what if you don't create a team first? What if you create a site? Same thing. You start the permissions at the site level, and those permissions flow down automatically unless you make a change. So if someone's an owner of a team, they have ownership rights all the way down to the individual records or the individual files and document libraries based on that unless you change it. And if someone's not on the team, they don't have that access unless you share or change it. And again, if you make a change partway through, then that change is now inherited at the sub levels, right? So I'm in a site and maybe I have a list and maybe I share that list with a person who's not a member of that site. Well, now that list and all the records in it is shared with that person. Or I share a document library. All the documents in that document library are shared. Or I share a folder. Only the folder in that document library and all the documents are shared. Or I can just share one document, one record, and that's all that that person has. Some of you are way ahead of me. Some of you are probably going, I'm not sure what he's talking about. That's okay. I'm giving you the summary now. We'll come back and dive a little deeper in. Similarly, if you break security, it breaks it at all levels below it too, right? So if you say everyone has permission to get into this entire site, but now at a list level or at a document library level, I'm going to break that security. I'm going to remove permission for a certain group of people to have access to that library. Okay, then they don't have access to the library or anything else in the library. All the permissions are broken below it. Okay, so quick summary and then let's walk through it. We're going to look at it in action, and we've created a Microsoft team called the Microsoft 365 Intranet Health Check. We use a project template to do that, and there's an owner of the team. Her name is Allie. There's some members here. If you guys use the Contoso demo environment, you'll know what some of the stuff is. We're going to update the team site, so we're going to share the site only with one person. So in that scenario, we might say we want Lynn Robbins to have access to the site, but not to the team. So we'll see how we do that. We're going to revoke permissions to the resources folder or channel, if you will, for all but the owners. So only the owners get access to the files in that folder. And then the general folder, we're going to share with everybody in the organization. Okay, so let's go ahead and watch how this works. Oh, wait a minute. Before I start that, I forgot I need to set this up for my video or my audio to share. Okay, great. If you guys don't hear the audio playing in a second when I start it, somebody please raise their hand or give me a mic check. I've created a Microsoft team here with several channels in it. You can see it's called M365 Intranet Health Check. Let's look at the team a little closer to see it has one owner, Allie Jamison, and it has 3 members, Nestor, Alan, and Megan. Now I want to share the site without sharing the team. So to do that, I'm going to open it in SharePoint. And I'm going to go to the home page. I don't really have to do that, but it just kind of makes what I'm doing a little clearer. And I'm going to go down to site permissions, add members, and I could add members to the group, which is essentially the same as adding members to the team. Or I can share the site only. That's what I want to do. And I'm going to share it with Lynn Robbins. And I can choose to send an email or not, and then click add. Okay, next what I want to do is I actually want to restrict some permissions. So I'm going to go to the document library, and I want to revoke permissions to the resources tab for everyone except for owners. So we'll go to manage access. We'll look under the direct access area, and you can see that Intranet Health Check owners are given owner permission. Intranet Health Check visitors, that's not who we're looking for. Intranet Health Check members. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop sharing to our members. And although we have no visitors, let's go ahead and stop sharing to that too, just in case someone adds some to the site. Now I also want to make the general folder available to everyone in the organization. So over here, do the same thing, go to the folder, click the ellipses, go to manage access. I'm going to add via direct access, and I'm going to share to Contoso because I know I actually have a Microsoft team named Contoso that's an org-wide team, and therefore there's an Active Directory group of that same name to support that team that will give me the permissions that I want. And again, I can notify or not, and then grant access. All right, so let's take a look at what this has done. First of all, it has done nothing to the team. If I refresh this team and go take a look at it, same owners, same members as I had before. Everything was done at the SharePoint site level. Had I wanted to share the team, I probably should have started at the team level instead. Now, on the site itself, let's go check site permissions. And you can see under site owners, full control, the only people I have in that group are the group called M365 Intranet Health Check, and it's only the owners of that group. Notice what might be confusing as this expanded is this group, this Active Directory group, has 4 members in it. One of them actually has a status of owner for the site, but it doesn't make that differentiation here. I just have to look at this to see it. But what's interesting is this is only showing me the group. It's not showing me the members of that group when I look at it from here. I have to expand it. Under site members, you can see here's Lynn Robbins, who I added to the site. Had I added her as a member of the team, she would have just gone under here. She would not have appeared here separately. So I can see Lynn has full edit permission to the site, just as if she were a member of the team, except that she doesn't have access to the team. And site visitors, I have nobody in there. That's done completely outside of Teams, and that would be for either external visitors or internal people who you want to give read-only access to for some reason. Now let's look at the resources folder, and really that looks pretty much the way we left it. Go over here and we go to manage access. You'll see that those groups have now been removed from this. Now, if I want a little closer look at this, if I go down here to the advanced settings, I get this more classical SharePoint view, and you can kind of see here's who really has access to this folder. But you can also see this warning. We've broken the security. This folder has unique permissions. So it's giving me a little warning that this is different from the rest of the site. And similarly, if I go up to, I think we did it on general, manage access, you can see there's all of my Contoso members right there who have access to this particular folder, but they don't have access to anything else unless they happen to be in one of those other groups. And again, if I go to advanced, you'll see that same setting here. You'll see that same warning here. All right, so that was the overview. We're going to dig a little bit more into some of those things, but what I want to talk about for a moment is a lot of what I just showed you, in my opinion, was kind of a bad idea. And bad idea, I mean, when you start breaking security, when you start messing with security, it becomes really challenging to remember what's secure and what's not, right? Like, remember, I shared an entire folder with the entire organization. Well, what if some member of that team doesn't know that and puts a document in there that's really meant for that project team and contains some important confidential information, and now that's just been shared across the entire organization because I opened that up for sharing. So kind of having, yes, can you go look at that? Yes. Can you go figure out who has access to what? Absolutely. But is a regular user going to necessarily know that? Or even is a fairly technically literate Microsoft team owner going to know exactly what has happened and be able to prevent some unnecessary sharing or unnecessary loss of access to important information? So you want to be really, really careful with how you do security in Teams and SharePoint. And we'll talk about that as we get into it. What you'll hear from me as we talk today is this approach we've started to adopt of saying we want to be as teams first as possible with everything we start to do with our digital employee experience, our digital employee workplace, right? Which includes largely Teams and SharePoint. So our preference as we work with a lot of clients is to say, to the greatest extent possible, if you create a Microsoft team to handle the subject matter that's at hand, and use the security roles within that Microsoft team to drive security throughout the SharePoint site that's related to it. Try not to change it anywhere. Try not to break it anywhere. If you need to, what this kind of suggests is you might need to actually create more teams and maybe private channels than you would ideally like to. So, for example, one scenario here is there might be a leadership team that says, hey, this is a leadership team for this organization, and most leadership information we share across the team. But occasionally we have a confidential project, like a merger and acquisition type of project, that we can't give everybody on the leadership team access to. So if that includes only people on the leadership team, but not all people on the leadership team, a private channel might be a reasonable option. Oftentimes, a project like that would include some people from the leadership team, but some people from some other teams as well. So in that case, you'd probably say, I want to create an entirely separate Microsoft team to have access to that. And there's another scenario down there you can look at as well. But I know for me, coming back a couple of years ago, I used to say, don't have too many teams. You want to keep things really, really succinct. And I've more and more become a believer that you actually probably want to have more teams to be able to handle all these different scenarios, rather than going in and trying to break security to make each team work exactly the way you need it to work. And that's not unlike what we've done in the past with classic SharePoint, whereas you did these things, you'd end up creating lots of sites and subsites trying to manage all of this stuff. If you follow some reasonable governance rules, it makes it easier. Now, I'm not advocating that you can never break the rules, but what I am advocating for is break them as rarely as possible to keep your life as the site owner or the SharePoint administrator as easy as possible and to minimize security risks as much as possible. So quick overview, I'm going to dive deeper into some of this, but I'm going to try to keep it simple to start with. When you think about Teams roles and how they map to SharePoint roles, quick overview is when you create a team and you have a team owner, no secret, that creates an owner group in SharePoint. So there's a team. When you create a team, it creates an Active Directory group by the same name as the team. When that creates a SharePoint site, it creates a SharePoint group. And in fact, it creates multiple SharePoint groups. One of them is just for owners, one for members, one for guests. So when you create somebody in Teams and put them as owner of a team, they're going to be an owner of the SharePoint site too, which gives them full control over the entire SharePoint site. If you add someone as a member to a team, it's going to make them a member of the site, which gives them a whole lot of control over the site too. They can, add, edit, delete content. They can even add columns. So if there's a document library and they want to add their own columns to it, they can. They can create their own lists and libraries. They can edit news on the site. They have a lot of ability to do stuff on the site, which you may or may not want. We'll talk about that. If you add someone as a guest to a Microsoft team, so a guest is generally an external person, right? They're outside of your domain. You might add them as a guest and you have some control within the team over what that guest can do, but they get added to SharePoint as a member also. Just like members of your team, internal people in your team, they get added as members to your SharePoint site, and they have all the same permissions that those site members have as well. Now, there's also a SharePoint group called visitors, and there's no relation right now between that and what you assign at the teams level. So that's something else. If you say, well, I want to make someone a visitor to my site, but not a guest on my team, you can do that. And it gives them much more restricted permissions on the site and no access at all to the team. A little confusing. We're going to go through some scenarios, but that was kind of an eye-opener to me as I delved in and looked at that and realized, wow, if I have an external guest, they have all the same permissions on that site as someone else who's a full-time employee of the organization. Okay, and then not going to dig into this very much because these are pretty self-evident, but when you create a team, you've got a lot of security settings available for the team itself. And beyond just members and owners, nothing you do here really carries over into SharePoint at all. But just to point out, at the team level, you do have permissions you can set for members, and you've got a slightly different set of permissions you can set for guests. So although you don't set those at the SharePoint level when in here, you do have some things you can restrict guests from as they participate in the team. And then you also have channel settings for those things as well. And interestingly enough, if you've ever noticed, the general channel on every team has slightly different security setting capabilities than other channels do. And presumably that's because the general channel might be more of a channel for the site or the team owner or administrator to do certain things with. So there's certain ways you might want to control that you may not want to control other channels with. If you've never looked at that, take a look. There's some interesting options in there. Okay, before I go on to the next topic, any comments or questions on that? Anyone have a different perspective on some of it? Hey, Paul, by the way, I think if it's okay, can you mute? I keep getting a little bit of interference from you from some background noise.
Sure.
Thanks. Feel free to unmute if you have any kind of question. I just want to make sure we're not distracting anybody. Thank you, sir. All right, let's talk about sharing then. So this is really user-controlled security, right? It's really not necessarily for the team owner, site owner. This is what people can just do. So all the members of your team, if you were a team owner, as I said before, you can share a file or record. So if this is a private team or if this is a public team and somebody's in it as a member, they can go to any document, they can go to any file, they can go to any folder, they can go to the site, and they can share it with other people. So even you as the owner can't control that unless you make some changes. Team owners, of course, can do all of that as well, but they can also add new members to the team. And then they can also share lists and libraries. So let's take a little look at how that works. By the way, all these little clicks I'm doing for videos, I'll share links to these. So if you just want to watch a little video snippet afterwards, you don't have to watch the whole video if there's something in here you want to drill into. I'm logged into the M365 Intranet Health Check site as a member of the team, Megan Bowen. Again, I'm a member of the team, not the owner of the team. Now, even as a member, I have a lot of capability to share. I can share a file. So if I go to any file and hit the sharing link, I can share that with anyone in my organization. And I have some options around exactly how the sharing link will work. I can also share a folder and all the contents in it. Or I can even share the entire site. We have the ability to add members to the group, which is really adding someone to the team as well. I actually don't have permission to do that. If I look at that, it will be view only, but I can share the site only to anyone I want to. So now I've shared the site and everything in it to somebody outside of the team. And I can go look at site permissions, or I can go check manage access to see who has access to what on an item by item basis. Switching over now, I'm now logged in as Allie Jameson. She is the owner of the M365 Intranet Health Check team. And of course, she has permission to do everything a member can do, but you can also share an entire document library or list if she chooses to. And she can do that by going up here to the library settings, permissions for this document library. And from here, she can add or remove individuals, SharePoint groups, or Active Directory groups to the sharing permissions here. All right, maybe a few new terms in there and it got a little bit confusing near the end. Promise we're going to cover that stuff, but some sense of what a user can do or a member can do, some sense of what an owner can do. If you're like me, when I see what members can do, it makes me a little uneasy that members might innocently or not so innocently do something that is a big security breach that we need to be careful about. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and stole some of my own thunder from this. So again, if somebody shares something and all of a sudden someone has access to something that shouldn't, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to audit? How are we going to monitor these things to make sure that these changes don't get made? Or how do we set them up in the first place to guarantee things aren't going to get shared that shouldn't get shared? So one thing you can do is team owners can actually change member sharing options. So it's sort of a global setting on a site-by-site basis. Super short video on that. Let's take a look. As the owner of a SharePoint site, I can limit how the members can share. If I go to the settings gear, down to site permissions, and then change how members can share. And I have some options. The default is owners and members can basically share just as I described to you previously. The next option is site owners and members and people with edit permissions can share files and folders, but only site owners can share the site. So you no longer have the security risk of a member sharing the site out to non-members. And then lastly, only site owners can share files, folders, and the site. So no sharing at all by anyone except for owners. You can also turn on or off access requests. So someone can request access to the site or some component of it. And if so, you can choose who gets those requests. All right, so that's kind of the first round of things that you can do as a team owner or a site owner to do that. Now, one of the downsides is that's really done on a site-by-site basis, right? Every team, every site that goes with a team, you would need to do that on. So you can try to automate that or do some of that from an administrator standpoint overall. But just remember, if it's something you want a lot of your owners to do, but maybe not all of them, you need to make sure you're educating them about that so that they set that up to help cover some of those security breaches. So here's one of my big debatable things for some of you folks who are deep into this and know a lot more about it than I do, and that is what I would recommend is trying to apply what I've done so far to 80% plus of your scenarios in SharePoint without going deeper, without getting into the stuff I'm about to get into, just to keep things simple, clean, and easy to operate. Understand that's not going to fit in all situations, and that's why I say 80 to 95%. But I know we've seemed to be working more and more lately with people who are just coming out of Classic and getting into modern SharePoint and online, Microsoft 365 Cloud and all that. And there's a lot of, hey, this is how we used to do it before, and we want to set it all up to kind of work the same way. And they're missing a really good opportunity to make things clearer, simpler, and more agile, while at the same time protecting security. So I encourage you to think about that actively. If you're going beyond this to do something, take a little time to pause first and say, is there another way? Is there a way I could stay within these boundaries and still achieve my objective? Or do I really need to go and kind of mess with the inner workings a little bit, break the security in a few key places, and risk making it challenging for me or someone else in the future to figure out where that is and why people can or can't see things they should or shouldn't see? All right, so now let's talk, this is more about the ownership level. We're talking more about the sharer level, the individual user. Now this is the owner. What can the owner really do to help administer site security overall for their SharePoint site that's, for now, still under a team? But again, most of what I talk about here is going to apply to the SharePoint site, whether it's under a team or not. Few things are different because Microsoft really locks down some of the security for sites that are connected to a team versus sites that aren't. And I will come back and talk about that. So I'm going to beat the horse to death a little bit more here, but also say, if at all possible, don't modify your SharePoint security, right? Use the built-in stuff. And again, some of the same points I made earlier. So I won't belabor that anymore. But again, I beg you to please consider it before you dive in. Let's look at about 6 different scenarios here for why you might want to go a little deeper and break some of those things. The first one, I just call it things members shouldn't do. And I already talked about sharing in the last little segment, so I won't repeat that, but I'll go through the next thing. And then we'll talk about external guests, a document library that might be hidden, and securing a list. There's a lot more scenarios in this, but I'm trying to come up with a few practical ones that help us work through some real life scenarios and how we would change to make those things work, or some of the limitations we might have. So remember, we're skipping number 1, going straight to number 2. So one thing that's a pet peeve of mine that I've run into time and time again is you probably don't want your members adding columns to your document library, right? Columns are metadata, and you might have specific process flows built around those columns, reports and views that those are really important to, and all of a sudden someone innocently goes into a folder inside of a document library and says, oh, there's something that would be really helpful for me to track about this folder. I think I'll go ahead and add a column there. Unbeknownst to them, it's really added that column to the entire document library, right? The way I think about it, if you're new to this, I think of a document library kind of as one table, right? An Excel or a database or whatever it is. If you're going to add a column to it, it's added to the whole table. Just because you're looking inside of a folder doesn't mean it's only there. It's everywhere in that document library. So what can we do about making that work? Super short video I'll show you for how we can go do some changes. There are some pros and cons to it that we'll come back and talk about in just a second. To change sharing permissions for a library, document library, navigate to the library, go to the gear, to library settings, and permissions for the document library. If the default permissions are still in place, you will see a stop inheriting permissions button. If you don't see that, it means the link has already been broken and you can skip this step. I'm going to stop inheriting permissions, and you can see it makes no immediate changes. Now I'm going to go to the group whose permission level I want to change. I'm going to edit the user permissions. And in this case, I'm going to switch it from edit to contribute, giving this group slightly lower permissions than the full edit permissions, and click OK. And you can see that permission level has now been changed. All right, I didn't get a lot deep into describing those different security levels. We'll come back to that in a bit. One of the nice pros with this is you noticed all 3 of those security groups, those SharePoint security groups, are still there. So if a member gets added to the team that this is associated with, that will flow through correctly still, right? Because they're now a member of that group. They will still have all the permissions that members of that document library are supposed to have, even though I've modified those to say those permissions are no longer edit, those permissions are contribute. So that's nice. I can kind of make that change, and it keeps itself fairly well self-maintained as I continue to add and remove people from the team. Do remember, it's got to be done, though, on a library-by-library basis, not even a site-by-site basis. If you happen to have 2 libraries on one site, you're going to need to make that change on both libraries if you don't want to have people do that. And you can't set it site-wide overall. You can't set it at the site level and have it inherit down. I think I've got a slide where I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, another scenario. Members can also update pages and news on a SharePoint site as well, which also seems problematic, right? You may not want all your members to be able to create new news stories or entirely new pages on the SharePoint site. That might put them in a place where they're really confused about where am I and what am I doing, and might make everyone else confused who comes to the site. So you probably want that permission to only be with a select group of people, maybe just owners, maybe others. So let's look at how we can make that change. If we want to change members' permissions to create and edit and otherwise interact with news items, we can just go to the site we want to change permissions for, go to the pages link, And pages are just another type of document library. So going up to the gear, we can go to library settings, permissions for the library. We will need to stop inheriting permissions from the parent. And in this case, we may want to edit member permissions to switch them to read only. So no ability to create or update, but to read only. And now that's been saved. So that was really similar to what we just looked at on the last one. One thing I think a lot of people don't often recognize is pages and articles are really kind of the same thing, and they're really just another document library. So you just need to think about it as a document library, and you're going to handle permissions accordingly. And you can even do it on an article by article basis if you want to. One potentially confusing element, if I turn off those permissions and make it read only, if the web part has the add component turned on, it's just a setting on the web part, that might still be there even though the user doesn't have permission, right? So it's not smart about understanding their permissions and only displaying if they have permission. So you can go and essentially just turn that setting off on the web part. If you don't, a user might go try to add a page, and a few clicks in, all of a sudden it kind of goes, you can't do any more. So it's not horrible, but it's not the best experience if you don't turn off that capability. So what we just did here, we talked about this diagram up front. What we just did here is we kind of went down to the list and library level, or library level in this case, and we said, we're going to stop inheriting permissions. Actually, that should probably be one down. We didn't do it at the site level. We did it on the list and library. So we broke that. And remember, we didn't remove any groups from those permissions. You still saw owners, you still saw members, you still saw visitors. We just said members' permissions are now altered. So if we go back to the team and we add a new member to the team, they're still in that SharePoint group of members. They're still going to get added there, and that's still going to flow all the way through. Now, we could have deleted the members group completely from the list, and that would mean even if we add new members to teams, it's not going to flow through because they're not in the member list at all. So some of that can flow through for us. Now, if we create an entirely new group and added people to it, that's not going to be managed at the team level at all. And if you want to undo that, if you've stopped sharing permissions at some point and you say, oops, I made a boo-boo, or there's a security breach here, we need to fix this up. If you go back to wherever that was that you created the stop inheriting permissions, you will now see a new button that says delete unique permissions. Hit that button, and it's basically going to roll everything back and say, I'm going to set this back to the default for the permissions people have to access this. All right, another thing you may not want your users to do on your site are your members. Sorry, I always say users. I should be saying members in this case. You may not want them to create lists and libraries of their own, right? It's like we want you to use what's here, but we don't want you to go too crazy getting creative and maybe mess everybody's world up. The bad news, there's not a supported way to do this on Teams connected sites. If you've got a site that's not connected to a team, you can go do this with some of the standard things I've already talked about. But if you go look closely at the SharePoint groups that are created when a Microsoft team owns a site, you want to call it that, or is associated with a site, you have almost no permissions to do anything with those. I can't remove those groups. I can't go edit those groups. They're locked down. I did find one backdoor way to do this, and some of you may know about it. I can actually go in to the permissions, the different permission levels, those things like edit and contribute. Each of those terms are actually defined behind the scenes with SharePoint, and I can change the settings for what edit means. And on that site, I can actually go change those settings. However, given how much Microsoft has locked down the ability to make other changes, I suspect that's a loophole they've overlooked for now, and they may not overlook it forever. You might wake up one day to find out they've undone what you did, or you can't continue to do it. So be careful with that. It's certainly not something I'd recommend to you. So how do you deal with that? How do you, if your users can do this, what do you do? First of all, you can just use the obfuscation method, meaning, well, it's kind of hard to navigate around in there and do that. So maybe I'm just going to hope that they don't and tell them not to if I find them doing it. I can train them as part of training and tell them not to do that. Or I can police it and fix it when it happens. But unfortunately, to my knowledge, there's no out-of-the-box way to do this at the moment. Now, let me throw it over to conversation here. I might be wrong about that. I'd love to find out I'm wrong about that, but I haven't seen an out-of-the-box way to do it. Does anyone have a different answer to that problem? I'm interpreting the silence as either someone talking on mute or nobody has a different answer to it. So that's fine. All right, let's move on. But that's what I hope to see Microsoft solve at some point. Well, Daniel, you're back on. You want to say something?
No, I mean, I don't think there's any way to block it right now. It's just, you can only police it, which does kind of bring up this one question is that, and then I can say that at the end, but the question is that wouldn't this save duplication of sites though? Like if you create a if you have a Teams team, then there's a SharePoint site in the back end. They can, create their own list and do, lightweight work over there because you already have a SharePoint site, as against them creating a standalone SharePoint site and doing all of that and then duplicate some of the work. So, I mean, I'm throwing that question out to you, but I'd love to hear from other people as that what would be the best approach? Use your existing Teams SharePoint site to do lightweight work like lists and things, or go ahead and create a standalone SharePoint site and do all this stuff over there. So, we can save that at the end, Jeff, if you've got some content to cover, we can save that at the end.
Oh, it's a good question. I love a little dialogue. So let's chat about it for a few minutes. It's nice to have a little dialogue interruption.
I think one of the big considerations in this particular scenario is thinking about the business case around the site. Teams is built around collaboration, and when we start limiting some of these tools, we limit the collaboration. Now, in real world application, a lot of users find that Teams is the gateway into Microsoft 365. Once they start using it for meetings, and then once they start using it for chat, and they start sharing files, then they start working in channels and working with the file tab, they work through Teams. Many users aren't going to go to the SharePoint site in the back end. They're not going to go and start creating lists and libraries. But if they do, is that really a bad thing? Because they're really just maximizing the capabilities of the tool. They can create a list, bring that into a channel through a tab. Now they've got another piece of information in the team where they already work. So I'm kind of the mindset to take kind of a lighter approach on this, and based off of the business case, give them the freedom to work inside of that SharePoint site so that they can self-service some of the solutions that they need. Now, I know in some industries, we're going to need to lock things down. We need a little bit more control over what they do. So I think a business case by business case approach and having a light touch in certain situations can definitely be advantageous, especially if you're an IT admin and you have very limited resources to scale across a very large organization. But I understand different industries is definitely going to vary. So just things for consideration.
It makes a ton of sense. And actually, I didn't really mean to imply, can we shut this down completely for everybody always? But there are definitely scenarios where you'd like to, right? Where you might have some users who like to go on little adventures and they tend to make big messes if you're not careful. So certainly there would be some scenarios where that would make sense. But I agree. I mean, Microsoft intended this to kind of be a little bit more open and agile so people can quickly go create their own mini apps and mini ways to get things done. And there's a lot of scenarios where you would not want to turn it off. But I can also see a lot where you probably would. Thomas, I saw you put your hand up a minute ago too. What's up?
Yeah, I think I have kind of a answer a little along the lines of Andy there, right? So I think that the thing that you're going to find, or at least in my experience, is that folks that are coming from a SharePoint world and experience understand its power, right? And they're creating solutions there, right? And when you're on the team side, to Andy's point about the collab, it requires somebody to understand that SharePoint's underneath it, go through the effort of creating that valuable solution, but then they have to publish it. So they have to publish it as a tab or another channel or some other way, right, to do that. And so you get into a situation where if a company is using Teams or say project collaboration, and in 90 days it's done, then yeah, locking something down so they don't find it would make sense, because just let them do what they're going to do. If they find it, keep it scoped. So you do have this delicate dance, because for the company that I'm a part of, we were acquired. So the company that I'm coming from, open, do whatever you want, no holes barred. And you're like, there's like 5 teams that people created, they're duplicating, they're dead. And the company we're going into, every 90 days, we're going to archive this, right? And now you need to justify it. And so if you get into that world, then SharePoint becomes the place that you have to stay, because you're going to be constantly trying to defend why Teams has to be around.
Right.
So
You're right. Lots
I
of
think
different scenarios.
yeah, exactly.
Cool. I just got a little alert saying my system audio cannot be shared. So when we get to the next video, I'll try again. And if it's not sharing, I might just be like lip syncing, and I'll do my best.
Nothing like a voiceover.
Good discussion. Thanks, you guys, for piping up with that. So what about adding external guests? And the use case here is you've got a team with an underlying site, but maybe you don't want an external guest on the team, but you do want them on the site. This came up just a couple of weeks ago, actually. I can't remember who, but it was with a client who was basically like, well, we shared the team, and oh my gosh, I'm a little worried about all this, other stuff that's going on and what might happen. And the reality was they didn't even know it is an option to not give the guest access to the team, but instead just give them access to SharePoint. And there's difference between a team guest and a SharePoint guest. Significant. A Teams guest has access to the whole team site and member access to the whole SharePoint site. A SharePoint guest, if you define that might be visitor, I can't remember, it'll be in the video. They have read-only access, right? You can give them other permissions if you want to, but they're only in SharePoint, and it's only read-only in SharePoint unless you open it up from that. So let's take a look at how that works. I'm going to try to share audio again. It says it is, so I think we're good. To share a team externally, you can just go to Manage the Team, add a member, and then enter the external email address of the member. You can see this has automatically designated me as a guest because it recognizes I'm not a part of the domain, and it does not allow me to create a member. Similar situation in SharePoint. If you want to share just the site or a component of the site with an external person, it's really very similar to sharing it internally. You can go to Site Permissions, Add Members, Share Site Only, and share it. And you can see I have some different options here to choose exactly how much access this person will have, and I can add them. Very similar process for sharing a folder or a file. You can use the sharing link, or you can use the share link here, or even manage access to grant them access. If you want to grant access to an entire document library, you would just go to the library settings, permissions. And in this case, I don't need to delete unique permissions. I just need to grant additional permissions to. Now, one thing to be aware of is if I'm sharing SharePoint, the site, or anything in the site with an external person, that person already has to be in Active Directory. When I add them as a guest to Teams, that automatically puts them in Active Directory. But if I want to put them in SharePoint without adding them to Teams, I need to have a Microsoft 365 administrator go create a guest account in Microsoft 365 Active Directory for me before I can then add them to the SharePoint site. And Paul, I saw your question come up. I think that last bit in the video, I suspect that might be what's going on there. It's if you go to share with an external person and they're not already in Active Directory, for example, if you're sharing a folder with them, I believe it will look kind of like it's shared with them, but it won't physically share with them until someone's added them as a guest to Active Directory. That's a little bit beyond my expertise, so can anyone else confirm that? Or Paul, do you know if that's the issue you might be experiencing?
I would say from a Teams perspective, one of the problems we see, Jeff, is that the permissions are inherited from Azure Active Directory. And so if you don't have guest abilities there, then essentially you've got some controls that walk you through what you think could work, and essentially it's going to stop. So that would be the one experience I've had where that fails.
Okay.
I can chime in a little bit on this. I would be interested to see what some of your settings are at the admin level as it relates to external sharing. Most of folder sharing is going to be controlled through the SharePoint Admin Center, and there's some specific controls that we can put in place where we can share files and folders with external users, but we can also limit it to maybe certain domains. There could be a blocker that's associated with that. There's also, in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, there's approximately 6 different locations where we can set up guest sharing. Some of it's done through the SharePoint Admin Center, and that applies to SharePoint and OneDrive, and by extension Teams. Some of it's controlled through the Teams Admin Center. Some of it's controlled through the default Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and then some of it's also controlled through the Exchange Admin Center as it extends into Microsoft 365 groups. So there's approximately 6 different locations that there could be settings applied to guest users. But in this specific situation where you're talking about folders, I would first take a look at the SharePoint Admin Center and what the permissions are there for files and folders, especially as it pertains to guests, and then see if it's maybe limited at that level, maybe limited by domain, maybe limited to certain guests, new and existing guests. That means somebody has to be a part of the Azure Active Directory as an official guest of the tenant versus like a new guest, which is a user that's not in there. It could be limited at that level. So I'd start at the SharePoint Admin Center, and then I kind of work my way through some of the other admin centers and the additional guest settings areas.
Cool. Paul, I hope some of that is directionally helpful for you. I'm realizing we've got 15 minutes left, and I'm probably 20% of the way through the content. So I'm going to suggest folks put questions in the chat, and everyone have chat open. If you have good responses to those questions, go ahead and put them in there. And I'm going to do some power speaking to get through as much of the rest of the content as I can in about another 15 minutes, if that's okay. Good questions, and I don't mean to discourage them. Just wanted to make sure that we're doing a good job. All right. So there's some other limiting you can do on external sharing as the SharePoint admin, not as a site admin. And let me go ahead and start the video to walk through this. I think this gets to a little bit of what Andrew might have been talking about a minute ago. The SharePoint administrator can also limit external sharing. To do this, go to the SharePoint Admin Center, and you can go to policies to limit this on a tenant-wide level. If you go down to sharing, you can see that there are a number of settings here to say, is SharePoint going to allow site owners and members the most possible permissions or the least possible permissions, and you can review those to see what they are. And that also has some OneDrive settings on it. There's some other settings here around exactly how much and what type of sharing you can do. You can set the default types of links that individuals can share and the default level of view permissions that they have. A lot of flexibility here. Remember, these are tenant-wide. Set them here, and these are the maximum level of permissions that anybody can grant under any circumstances. Now, on a site-by-site level, you can go over here to manage sites. You can choose your active sites and scroll down to one of the ones you might want to update. And from here, you can select the site. You can do general permissions just as if you were administering the site with a few other options there. You can also do the external sharing policies here, which look pretty similar to what you saw on the tenant-wide settings, except that they apply only to the site. And remember, the highest level you can grant here is the highest level granted at the administration level. One thing as a SharePoint administrator, it can be tempting to start knuckling these down, saying, I want to create as secure of an environment as I can. And we've worked with some clients recently who did that, and we're asking questions around, we feel like people are getting around our security settings, and we realize people are setting up, Dropbox and Google Drive and stuff like that because they're completely incapable of sharing anything via Microsoft 365 outside of their world, but they have to. So they're just finding other ways to do it. And now there's no control or visibility around that at a centralized level. So it can be tempting to go in and really lock that down. I would say you've got to really work hard to find the right balance for your organization. Let's look at adding a hidden document library. So you might have a site which is widely shared, but maybe you've got a document library, for instance, maybe you've got a standard operating procedures site, and you say, I've got a published document library where people can go see all the active standard operating procedures, but I want another library where I can edit and control them. And I know there's a lot of ways to do that, and that might not be everyone's favorite, just sharing one potential scenario where this may come up. Let's create a hidden library on a SharePoint site that only a few members can see. To start with, we'll create a new document library. Let's call it internal files. It brings us to the document library. Now let's go to the library settings and then to permissions. And we're going to start by stop inheriting permissions. To break security, we'll leave owners here, but let's get rid of members and visitors. And now let's grant some new permissions. And I'm going to grant an external user permissions. An internal Active Directory group permissions. And some permissions to some members who are already a part of this group. Now notice here when I start typing this, I get several shortcuts. What's a little confusing up here is these two names are duplicate, but they're not actually the same thing. This first one is a SharePoint group. Whenever a team is created, 3 SharePoint groups are created to support security for that team. A members group, an owners group, and a visitors group. I can tell which one of these two is the SharePoint group based on the tooltip. If I hover on this one, you see this basic description. If I hover on this one, you see a more detailed description. This is the Active Directory group that's also created to support the team. So let's add the Active Directory group to this. And let's also add the SharePoint group to it. And we will share. I'm going to refresh this. So you can see everybody who this has been shared with. I could have given different permission levels as well. They all have the same, but you can see I have an external user. I could have had an internal user too. I have a SharePoint group, and I have 2 domain groups or Active Directory groups that I've shared with this. So now these people all have access to this document library, but other people who may otherwise have access to the site do not have access to this document library. Okay, so trying to cover that scenario and also cover that when you share, you've got really 3 different levels, right? Users, SharePoint groups, Active Directory groups, all are things that you can share something to. Okay, let's talk about securing lists. This might be our last topic. I might race through some of the others a little bit. By the way, afterwards, I get this to the user group folks as a PDF, and all the links will be hot links in it. So you can go through the PDF and just click the links if you want to look at anything you missed or anything that you want to drill into a little more. So remember this, first of all, when you're talking about securing a list, you already know almost everything you need to know to secure a list, because lists are almost exactly like document libraries. So we went through a lot of these things already. List here, there's a list here you can read through. What we really need to know is, so how can I get security down to the record level on my list, right? So not the whole list itself so much, but record by record. What are the options? And what about field level security? And let's just save some time here and say that's really not supported as Microsoft lists. I think there have been some ways some folks have done it in the past, but certainly not a easy to configure way to do field level security, meaning when Jeff looks at this list, he can't see fields 1 and 2, but when Kelly looks at the list, he can see those 2 fields. So we're really going to focus just on record level security. Here's our scenario. Let's say an organization says, hey, we want to have a list of all of our Microsoft teams. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, because we've got some teams that are public. Okay, everyone knows those are there. We don't need a list of those. But we've got a lot of teams that are private. But they're not so private that we don't want people to know they exist. We just don't want people to come and go with them ad hoc. We want people to be able to discover them so they don't go create a duplicate team, that they know knowledge is there and they can request access to it and so forth. But we do know we've got some private teams we don't want people to even know they exist. Like, hey, we're about to get bought by company XYZ. We don't want people to know we're going through that negotiation until we're ready to make that announcement. So we don't want people to know that that exists. So we want this list and we really want it to be comprehensive. We need some record level security to make sure people can only see what they should see. Several approaches we can take to this. One could just be, we're going to set up the site with no one having access to the site at all, and we just share records one off as needed. And when we do that, if they come to the site and something's shared, they just see the ability to navigate to the list, and they just see the records they can see. Or we give everyone access to the site and to the list on the site, but then we break security only in those cases where we don't want people to see something. That's perfectly valid. And from a technical standpoint, I would say if you're breaking security less often to take away privileges, that's generally, to me, the preferred approach. Just less work. I'm lazy. But in this case, there's a con, and that is if someone does go create that one record and it doesn't hide it quickly enough, somebody might actually see that record before you go through the process to hide it. So we're going to go for the last scenario here where we say everyone has access to the site. The list is generally hidden. None of the records are visible by default. And then we're just going to share each record that we need to share, which will be most of the records. All right, so let's take a look at how we did this. I have a little bit of information about how I set up the list here and that kind of thing. We're certainly not going to get into that today. Let's just do the walkthrough. Let's take a look at one approach for securing a Microsoft list in SharePoint and Teams. So in this case, we have a list called Teams Listing, and we've got some records in here. The first thing in this case we want to do is we want to shut off access to the list in general unless we explicitly give permission to have access to a record. So let's start by going to our list settings. We'll go to the permissions, and we're going to stop inheriting permissions from the site to give the list its own unique permissions. We'll leave owners in place, but we're going to get rid of members and visitors. All right, now back to our Teams listing. Now the only people who can see anything in this list are owners of the list. Let's go ahead and share some of these records. So I'll share this particular one. And what I might want to do is share this organization-wide. I can share it with whoever I'd like to share it with, but in this case, for this scenario, if it's visible to everyone. So we'll share it with everyone. Now we might want to change some settings to make it view only, and then we can change our sharing. By the way, we might have also wanted to not notify people when we shared it with them. I could repeat that for each of these ones that we want to have visible, but then I would not repeat it for this hidden one. And by doing that, everybody could see all of my visible items. Nobody could see the ones that I flagged as needing to be hidden from everybody. Okay, so that's how that works. A little bit arduous, but there might be a workaround here we'll talk about in just a second. And there it is. So Power Automate actually has some pretty robust record sharing capabilities in it. So you can really automate that whole little process I just went through with a simple Power Automate that, when a record's created or updated, check that value. Is it hidden or is it visible? And if it's visible, just share it with everybody. If it's hidden, make sure that you've turned off sharing. So if someone decides they need to change it, that works. Pretty simple Power Automate flow to be able to create. Lists also have something that's a little different from document libraries. You can do owner-based record level security. I'll do air quotes around owner. It's really creator-based. What this means is basically I can go in and under list settings, I can go and look at item level permissions and I can choose exactly how much I want to share this. Forgot I had a video for this one, so let me just play that instead of trying to talk it through. Unlike document libraries, lists can also be secured at the record level based on what you would consider to be the owner of a record in a list. Let's take a look at how we do that. From a list, navigate to list settings. And you're actually going to go to advanced settings, not to permissions, but to advanced settings for the list. And then if you go down just a little ways, you will see item level permissions, and you have a number of options here. So the default ones are all users can read all items, and all users can create and edit all items. You can secure read access to say only allow people to read items created by the user. So only the items you create can you also read. You can also leave that open to everybody, but instead say create items and edit items only that were created by the user. So users can own their own records for create and edit purposes, but everybody can see the records that those users have created. So just a couple of ways to kind of automatically handle the security if you can associate it with the name of the person who created the record. Okay, the last couple of minutes here. So I think given the time, I probably won't even go into these, but suffice it to say, there's some other slides. A few of these have other videos in them. We talk a little bit about what if you've got a hub site or a communication site or just a team site that's not connected to a Microsoft team? What are the differences and best practices around that? The review and reference kind of starts top down and says, okay, now that you've heard all this, here's the terms again, here's a little more depth, here's some more complexity that I tried not to get into, but if you're ready for that, you can go into that. And then at the very end, the last section there, I talk more about as a SharePoint administrator, as the SharePoint administrator and or the Teams administrator, what can I do at that level to help add security, add capabilities, that kind of thing. Just a high level review of some of the options there. So I'm going to call that a wrap and make this available to you guys afterwards. I'm happy to have more of a conversation with you afterwards if you'd like, but hopefully we got through some of the more important content. Andy or one of the organizers, is there anything you guys want to say before? Okay.
Yeah, no, sorry, I was trying to unmute and cameras. I think we're gonna have to do a part 2 because like it's such a deep topic as you start to get into all the intricacies. Like just going back to the question that we had a moment ago with just the guest permissions as it related to a folder. There's 6 different settings in just the admin center, and then as we start to drill down from Teams to SharePoint to document libraries, there's multiple layers of permissions and multiple layers of settings as we kind of go through that onion, and then adding Teams on top of that just adds another layer of complexity to it. I've been live tweeting and taking notes and publishing this out for our users, and I hope that everybody has gotten a pretty thorough understanding. Jeff, you've done a really deep dive into this, and this has been really, really good, very, very detailed. I know you said that you've got the PowerPoint in a PDF format with some links. We'll make sure that we get that out to the group. And I know there were a couple of questions along the way, but I just want to, on behalf of the group, say thank you for putting together such a detailed presentation on this. And I'm going to stick around for a few more minutes just in case any other questions come through. I'm not sure if we lost you, Jeff, if you're still there or not.
Still here.
All right. Yeah. But I'm going to stick around for just a few more minutes, just in case any other questions come through. But yeah, I think we're going to have to go into maybe a part 2 at some point, because like we're really starting to deep dive into this, especially when you start getting into list item level permissions. That's such an obscure feature. Like Microsoft, I don't even know if they have an article on that anymore. I know there's a few blogs out there. I'm in the process of tweeting about that right now, based off of that last screenshot that you put up. But yeah, getting into item level permissions inside of a SharePoint list, and then the consideration of that on top of the Teams considerations. Yeah, that's this is awesome stuff. You need to turn this into an entire workshop and go ahead and market that and sell that and get that out to the community.
That would rate right up there with governance for popularity. Really important subject, but not the most exciting one. Thank you. I almost think it needs to be broken into sort of the Teams owner security view of the world, the hub and unconnected site, and then SharePoint administrators, because it's really overwhelming for the site owner to get into what all the SharePoint owner the SharePoint admin can do.
and being the SharePoint admin and like overseeing this across like a group of people, like that's an overwhelming job in and of itself. So being able to put some of this on the site owner and empower them to control some of this is definitely um, advantageous to the organization as a whole. But I think like to simplify it, kind of going back to something you said earlier on, anywhere we can put that inheritance model in place and kind of simplify and push down that inheritance model is definitely going to make life a lot easier for us. But then going to something we said kind of in the middle, it's business case by business case. There's definitely not a one size fits all approach to this. And you have to be flexible when you start really drilling down into the multiple layers of permissions and controls, especially with teams on top of SharePoint, and then factoring in lists and libraries and folders and items and documents, and it just goes on and on. This has been really great. I hope everybody that's been here really has taken a lot from this. I know I'm really looking forward to posting the presentation on our YouTube channel and seeing what happens there. And I will follow up with you, Jeff, and we'll get the PDF out to everyone. But thank you for such a deep technical dive into this. I think this is really going to be advantageous, especially for those site owners and teams owners that are not in the admin centers, really trying to wrap their heads around a lot of this.
Well, thanks you guys for inviting me and having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to the SharePoint community whenever I can, and Charlotte in particular. Thanks so much for letting me be a part of things.
Yeah, absolutely. You've been such a valuable member of the community for a number of years now. We're just really excited that you were able to participate tonight and really do this deep dive. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
Anytime.
Well, I think that's it for the October meeting. Again, stick around for a couple. I'll stick around for a couple minutes just in case there are any other questions, any other conversation that happens. Hope you'll join us November 18th as we talk about the recap from Microsoft Ignite and all the new goodness that Microsoft announces the first week of November at Microsoft Ignite. By the way, it's free. It's online. You can participate. All you have to do is register. But join us on November 18th when we talk about all things Microsoft Ignite.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.